Hello, I'm Cadwyn Morris and this is my top 5. Now, the last time I done one of these it was my top 5 episodes of Lois and Clark. This time it's my top 5 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. Why Star Trek The Next Generation? Well, it's simple. When I was growing up I was watching Star Trek the original series and it was on sort of BBC Two, or it was on a Sunday and I would watch it alongside things like Doctor Who and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Land of the Giants. But I wasn't really a Star Trek fan. I liked the show and if it was on I would watch it, for sure. But it wasn't until Star Trek The Next Generation came along that pulled me right into the universe and went, guess what mate, you're a Trekkie, deal with it. And that's true, that's pretty much it. And I think it was like that for a lot of people as well. Mainly because during that run of the show, I think Star Trek was out there, out in public media, and out in sort of pop culture, but it was sort of a side note, it was sort of on the side. And it was when Star Trek The Next Generation came along that it just erupted and people stopped being like, oh, he's a Trekkie, and it was like, no, I'm a Trekkie. It did change people's perceptions, and it did certainly do a lot for things like Star Trek conventions and all that stuff. It was a whole new experience. So let's forget about all that and let's look at my top 5 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. In at number 5 is the episode Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2. Oh yeah, some of you have just gone, what? It's like, yeah, it's my number 5, it's not my number 1, and I know a lot of you are going, that should be his number 1. Okay, interested now? Yeah, it's my number 5. Okay, here's why it's my number 5. Best of Both Worlds Part 1, 2 and Family, I put them, all 3 of those episodes together because that's the story, that's the full circle of the story. And it takes 3 episodes to really tell the story in full. You've got the start where the Borg show up, then you've got to deal with the Borg, and then Family deals then with the aftermath. And yes, it's a great story, but the setup comes from the previous episode where they first encountered the Borg, and it was that episode that led to Best of Both Worlds. And when the Borg show up, we instantly know what this is, what this means. We saw how the Enterprise couldn't deal with the Borg before. Now they're invading Federation space. It's like, holy crap, it's about to hit the fan. And it does. But it does take 3 episodes to tell the full story, in which case I'm more interested in episodic TV. I'm more interested in seeing how the story plays out in 45 minutes. As good as Best of Both Worlds 1, 2 is, plus Family, I put it to number 5. It's still in my top 5. It's still one that's well worth watching. So that's Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2 at number 5. Then what's my number 4? Well, my number 4 pick is A Fistful of Datas. Yeah. This list is all to hell. You weren't expecting it to be this way around, were you? No, I know. I was surprised myself. But actually, I put A Fistful of Datas at number 4 on the list because it's a holodeck story. And the problem with it being a holodeck story is that as good as the episode is, it does involve the sort of cheap trait of the holodeck going wrong. We'd seen this happen in previous episodes of The Next Generation, such as The Big Goodbye, which does lead you to ask the question, why the hell does somebody program a holodeck with the ability to turn the safeties off? Why is that a feature? Anyway, never mind. The story revolves around Worf, Alexander and Deanna Troi being trapped on the holodeck during a glitch where the safeties are turned off and all the characters start becoming data. This is a fun episode. There's no way of saying it. This is a fun episode. The other thing that this episode does really well is after 6 years we finally get some character development in Deanna Troi. She's no longer psychobabble Imzadi, chocolate lover, we find out that she's got a bit more to her than that, and that she does love, westerns as well. So we get a bit more character. It only took 6 years. 6 years to get some extra character development out of Deanna Troi. But yeah, this was a really fun episode, and it's well worth a view. It only takes 45 minutes, and it's a damn good story, and it's a real good episode of The Next Generation, which is why it's in my top 5. Anyway, that's Fistful of Datas at number 4. So what's number 3? Well, number 3 is Relics. Yeah, number 3 is Relics. Why? Because out of all the episodes of The Next Generation, very few ever referenced the original series. Very few ever referenced the movies or older times. And Relics was a love letter to the original show. There was dialogue being used in this show which referenced the original series, and we even get a nice appearance from the original bridge. Although it's a holodeck recreation, we do get to see the original bridge in all its sort of almost all its glory. Some of the lines that get references, obviously the what is it? It's green. Scott even mentions the Elan of Troyes. I mean, this was just a pure love letter to the original show from the very start as well. When Scotty comes out of the transporter, the visual effects being used and the audio effects being used were that of the original show. They weren't recreated to make it look like the original show. They used the original stuff. So that's why it's so high up on my list. It's the show it is the episode that made me go back and re-examine and look at the original show of Star Trek for what it was for storytelling, and it made me fall in love with the show all over again. So I believe it's a very important episode and a beautiful episode, and that's why it's my number 3. Number 2 on the list is the episode Disaster. Why is this number 2? Because it's not number 1. No, it's number 2 because this episode I really enjoyed, because it took the mundane life of aboard the Enterprise and just turned it on its head. It literally just went, this is what happens in between an adventure on board the Enterprise, and when nothing is happening, this happens. And people aren't doing anything specific. People, they're not on their way to a meeting or a conference or to pick up an ambassador or anything. They literally go in from A to B. There's nothing going on. And the Enterprise gets hit by, I think it's a quantum string, and people are all over the place, Unfortunately for Picard, he's trapped in a turbo lift with a bunch of kids. Unfortunately for kids, they were trapped in a turbo lift with Picard. So people were out of position. Geordi wasn't in engineering, he was in the shuttle bay with Beverly Crusher. Nobody was where they were supposed to be, and they were stuck. The Enterprise was in a disastrous situation. The warp core was due to erupt. There was nothing anybody could do about it. People were not at their posts because it was just like one of those, it was the average day and it all went tits up. Again, this showed other characters, this pushed other characters to the front of this episode. And again, more character development out of Deanna Troi in this episode as well. And it did show sort of her strengths as a commanding officer when she had to deal with people like Ro Laren. So, yeah, that's why I think Disaster deserves to be number 2, is because I believe out of all the run of the original series, the movies, and The Next Generation, this is the only one that addresses the sort of what happens if something really bad happens to the Enterprise on their average day off, kind of thing. So that's my number 2, and my number 1 pick for best episode of Star Trek The Next Generation is Yesterday's Enterprise. I love this episode. This episode does what Star Trek The Next Generation done so well, which is to take this really small idea and just blow it up, just magnify it to huge proportions. What they do with this story is to say this is an average event that happens, this is an uncommon event that happens to an enterprise throughout history, but this is what happens if that enterprise no longer exists in time. And when that happens, the Enterprise D radically changes. There are people who were dead who are now back alive because the entire timeline has changed. Okay, forget the J.J. Abrams alternate timeline movie. This one done it first, okay? This one stepped up to the mark and went, actually, you don't need to radically change time. You only need a tiny little ripple, and centuries later, there's huge changes. The other thing that I liked with this episode was that because of the changes in the timeline, the Federation was at war. And it was acknowledging that the Federation at war isn't particularly good. When it comes to actually, you know, having armadas face armadas, the Enterprise and the Federation, they're not in a good spot. And they even acknowledge it towards the end of this episode that they're expected to lose. But this goes back to the entire event that with the Enterprise C comes through from the past. By taking it out of time, it creates this tiny little ripple, but the offshoots of this tiny little ripple produce massive waves in difference in time. I think it's a brilliant episode. It's an incredible way of bringing somebody back from the dead, and it's an incredible way to produce alternate stories with that character, which you wouldn't normally get. So that's my top 5 list of my top 5 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. What do you think of my episode choices, and what do you think of the order? Not only that, but I'd like to know what your top 5 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation are. Anyway, that's it from me. I'm Cameron Morris, and I'll see you later, guys.